Jonathan Turley joins us now, constitutional law professor, Fox News contributor. He's over at GW. Jonathan, welcome back.
Thank you.
Jonathan, first off, on the Mayorkas impeachment, is this more about just raking him over the coals and making him try to answer for what he's done? Because impeaching him is going to be impossible, right?
Right. I think that this is really a non-starter, and it's a controversial use of impeachment because impeachment's really not there for people who do their job poorly. The question is whether they can show that Mayorkas did something beyond simply being incredibly negligent and bad at his job. I think that's rather obvious. I mean, he is a disaster in his position. But in terms of high crimes and misdemeanors, they'll have to establish something beyond that. So I think that in some ways it is going to be a hearing that is at best going to try to get more information on Mayorkas. You know, he comes close at points because he has a sort of inherent dishonesty to him. I mean, when I've watched him in hearings, he really doesn't bat an eye when he, shades the truth. The example of that was over the border agents when he basically threw the agents under the bus, even though we now know that he was fully informed that there wasn't any flogging that occurred. That's fairly typical of the secretary.
Jonathan, let's talk about the former president of the United States. He put a petition out yesterday to get back on the Colorado ballot if he ever actually left it. Technically, I'm not sure how you categorize it. Maine's trying to do the same thing. Others are lined up to see how the Supreme Court will rule. First off, what did you think of the president's brief?
Well, I thought the brief is spot on in the sense that it raises all of the issues that undermine this theory. This is just a petition for review, so it's not the type of extensive brief that you see once the merits are under review. It's going to be a very interesting day because Colorado Supreme Court did something that was a bit curious in its opinion. It said that if this matter is pending before the Supreme Court and the court has not answered, that the default will kick in and that Trump will stay on the ballot. It's a little bit weird because they're the highest court in Colorado. Usually they leave it up to the Supreme Court to decide if they want to enjoin, because after all, they're making a decision based on their own state authority. What it meant is that Colorado could avoid a review, which I think they would like, by simply running out the clock. So if the Supreme Court just lets this go, his name will be on the ballot, and then Colorado could theoretically come in and say, we want you to moot this appeal because now nothing's going to change. He'll be on the ballot, so no harm, no foul. I hope that the court doesn't buy that because this is being tried in a dozen states.
Jonathan, I don't know if you've picked up the New York Times yet, but this morning David French wrote a column, and the headline is, "The case for disqualifying Trump is strong." They talked about the violence around his movement. They talked about, obviously, January 6th, and he said he spent the whole time looking at the briefs, and he believes that there's a strong case to not only kick him off Colorado, but kick him out of the election.
Yeah, I disagree. There's a host of problems with this theory. I mean, first the question is, does it apply to the presidency? That's a good faith argument that it may not. It refers to a different oath. It refers to a federal, official, which is usually not how you refer to the president. The president appoints federal officials. But the biggest problem for me is that the 14th Amendment, Section 3, deals with rebellion and or insurrection. This was neither. This was a riot. And at some point, mature minds have got to kick in here and say, look, he has never even been charged with incitement, let alone rebellion and insurrection. But more importantly, putting aside the fact that he hasn't been convicted, this wasn't a rebellion or insurrection. I know that the other side, has really tried hard to portray it that way. But the American people don't even view it that way. Polls indicate that the public views this as a protest that became a riot. It doesn't excuse what happened.
He says
there's a host of problems.
He said Trump was not trying to seize and hold the Capitol, nor declare a breakaway republic, was what they're saying. He says, but it's true that Trump wasn't declaring a breakaway republic, but he says he was attempting to seize and hold far more than the Capitol. He was trying to illegally retain control of the executive branch of the government. His foot soldiers didn't wear gray or deploy cannons, but they did storm the Capitol, something the Confederate Army could never accomplish.
Yeah, I think that the hyperbole there became a bit of a runaway. I mean, look, we've had violent protests in this country. There were violent protests when Trump was inaugurated. And at that time, there were Democratic members that voted not to certify Donald Trump. Were they also rebellious? I mean, what they're suggesting here is really otherworldly. I mean, if this is going to be the new theory, it'll be replicated. It'll metastasize throughout the country. I've got a column out today in the New York Post talking about the new effort to bar Congressman Perry under the same theory. Democratic members of Congress have asked to bar dozens of Republican members of Congress under the same theories. That's the slippery slope that we're about to step on.
And you realize how dangerous this is for both sides, because we're already seeing with impeachment and sequester. We see with the Supreme Court justice used to need 60 votes. Now, thanks to Harry Reid, they need just over 50 votes, simple majority. We're seeing now with the impeachment being used so haphazardly on Trump, now you could argue that even though I want to see the investigation, we're heading towards that way with Biden. Now, all of a sudden, if you're kicking Trump off, now I watched Ron DeSantis the other day and says, you know what? I think that Joe Biden, the way he's let 8 million people on the border, I think that should make him ineligible to run again for re-election. I think that's impeachable. This is how runaway this whole thing has become.
Yes, it's a tit-for-tat politics. And the terrible thing is that this is the most successful and stable democracy in the history of the world. And yet after this long, successful run, you have blind advocates today trying to introduce an instability in that system that could destroy it. I mean, this is the type of theory that can destroy a democracy. And, there's a poll shows that the majority of people do not believe in this disqualification. Some 40% do. But it shows how dangerous this is. We are a divided country, and you have people who are trying to win this election in the courts.
What about people who say it doesn't matter? I can't get concerned with the ramifications of making the right decision. Yeah,
I think that's part of this is a failure of leadership, but it's also a crisis of faith. We've lost faith as a nation, not just in the Constitution, but in each other. That's what the Constitution is. It's an article of faith. That is, we say that we're going to play by the rules. We're going to support each other's right to free speech. We're going to support democracy regardless of the outcome. But what you see here is the effect of that crisis of faith. These are faithless people who are saying, let's just prevent people from voting for Trump. And it shows that blind rage, but it also shows that they've lost faith in the thing that defines us.
Hunter Biden is looking to get on the offensive, and he's putting together a documentary from his perspective on what exactly his last few years have been like leading up to his trial. It also is clear that this benefactor has given him at least $4 million. Not sure exactly why, but I think that probably we might be able to get to the bottom of it. What does Hunter Biden's January look like?
It does not look particularly good. The House is moving towards a contempt resolution, which will have to go through committee and then go to the floor. It'll be interesting, again, to see Democrats vote unanimously against it. You could not have a more obvious act of contempt. These are the Democrats that just voted for a series of contempt sanctions against Trump officials. Well, here you've got someone who literally stood outside the Capitol building and effectively taunted the committee, refused to go in under subpoena. And yet, when that resolution hits the floor, you're likely to not have a single Democrat who says, you know what, this is wrong. Indeed, you have Congressman Swalwell who helped facilitate this. He helped facilitate an act of contempt. And those same Democrats are going to take no action against him either.
You pointed us to the press secretary coming out and saying the president was fully aware of what his son was going to do, and that's legally problematic.
It is, and the committees are now looking into that, and I think that it's an obvious problem. We don't know what the president and his son discussed, but we also don't know how much the White House staff was involved in these discussions. But what Hunter Biden did is a federal crime. And with the Trump people, Congress rapidly held people like Bannon in contempt, and the Department of Justice set a record in getting him into court and getting him convicted, it seemed. So the question now is, even though this city floats on a sea of hypocrisy, whether anyone is going to say, all right, I've got to apply the same standard even with the president's son. And then when it comes to the president, if he encouraged his son to commit a crime, it's serious because this crime is not just contempt. If that's true, and we don't know if it's true, but if he encouraged his son to commit this act of contempt, he was talking to a witness who was being called to give evidence against himself, against the president. Hunter was being called about his father, not about Hunter Biden, about Joe Biden. So if Joe Biden participated in encouraging him to commit contempt, he was encouraging a witness from appearing who could give evidence against himself.
And lastly, from your experience, and this is unique, we have an impeachment inquiry that's going to go on for we're in 10 months now. We get a new Congress. What type of timing are we looking at? When do you think that it's reasonable to think that they have to make a decision when an inquiry actually becomes an impeachment?
Well, they have a little bit of runway here because they're very likely going to take a trip to the courts on some of these witnesses. But ideally, they would move within a couple of months because you're going to have to bring this to the floor. But timing is essential here. They want to make sure that they have a complete case. And one of the complaints I made against the Democrats is they used what I called a snap impeachment. They had no hearing at all. They had no record at all. They just went straight to the floor and impeached an American president. That's not what the Republicans are doing here. They're doing it the correct way, which is what I said in the first Biden impeachment hearing, is that this is how it's supposed to be done. You hold this inquiry and you create that factual record. I think they'll need a couple of months to complete that record, but they're making strides now. There's a lot of people who are scheduled to come before the committee and fill in these missing gaps.
If they get this, and we see it's already damning, and the evidence that people are talking about that goes beyond reproach. And I watch the other channels to get a perspective, and they do have a sense. Now they're admitting that Hunter's a bad guy and got himself into a lot of trouble, but they are not quite ready to say the president was there along the way. How much he knew is something that they're willing to admit. If you get there and say this is bad, but I don't think we're going through impeachment, politically, Jonathan, this will be my last question. I'll stop bothering you. Politically, does it look like a Biden victory?
I don't think you come out of this claiming victory if you fall just short of the impeachment standard. It's already damaging Biden. You can see that in the polls, and it should. The Bidens were engaged in raw influence peddling. But the key for the House is to be able to control the narrative. They've got the media, which has been trying every different rationale and narrative to obstruct this. The key for the Republicans is to remind the public, influence peddling is corrupt.
Yes.
That form of corrupt, and if the president knew about it, he's corrupt.
Jonathan Turley, you're not. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Appreciate your insight. Jonathan Turley, thank you.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.